On the morning of March 24, 2015, officials from the Wayne County Sheriff's Department arrived at the Martin Luther King Apartments on Detroit's west side to carry out a court-ordered eviction of 35-year-old Michelle Angela Blair. When they knocked on Blair's door, her unusual and unsettling behavior immediately caught their attention. Suspecting something was wrong, the authorities entered her apartment. Inside, they made a horrific discovery: the bodies of 2 children hidden in a deep freezer. The children were later identified as Blair's 13-year-old daughter, Stony Blair, and her 9-year-old son, Stephen Gage Barry. Shocked by the grim scene, authorities took Blair into custody for questioning, while her surviving children were placed under protective care. The details of the case would soon emerge in an interrogation, revealing a tragic story that shocked the Detroit community and gained widespread attention across the country. Blair was taken into custody within hours and questioned by investigators, while her surviving children were placed in protective care. During the interrogation, Blair asked if her children were still there, expressing a desire to reconcile with her aunt. She explained that she had distanced herself from her aunt to keep secrets hidden, although she still felt deep affection for her. After confirming her understanding of her constitutional rights, Blair began answering questions about her background. She revealed she was a Detroit native with a 10th grade education, went by the nickname Angel, and had lived in her apartment for 9 years. She showed Officer Diaz her tattoos, including some with her children's names. As the interrogation progressed, Blair inquired if her children's names had been released in the news and whether their fathers were aware. When asked directly about Stony and Stephen, she admitted that their bodies were in the freezer. Within the first hour, Blair confessed to placing them there, explaining that she believed her children had harmed each other in ways she described in disturbing detail. She claimed this behavior had been ongoing for years, beginning when the children were young. Blair alleged that she discovered this behavior after returning home one day and finding her children acting suspiciously. Blair revealed that her children's bodies had been kept in the freezer for years, with her account providing a grim and tragic narrative that left investigators stunned. The interrogation, conducted in 2015, marked the beginning of a case that would shock Detroit and draw national attention. In 2012, Michelle Blair described an incident involving her son that led to her eventual actions against him and his sister. She explained that she came home one day to find her son acting out a disturbing scenario with his toy wrestling figures. Concerned and confused, she asked him why he was making the toys behave that way and whether anyone had done something similar to him. At first he denied it, but eventually, with his head down, he admitted that someone had. Blair went on to confront her other child, believing they were involved, but he denied the allegations. Blair described feeling intense frustration and confusion as she sat by the door, listening to her son's recounting. She remembered moments from the past where she'd been angry with her son for unexplained injuries or emotional outbursts, believing they had other explanations. But now, in her mind, they were all connected. As the interview continued, Blair confessed that she eventually responded with violence toward her son, describing how she struck him repeatedly after going back upstairs to confront him again. Her actions ultimately led to her son's death, an outcome that came to light only later during the investigation and court proceedings. In 2012, Michelle Blair described how, over the course of several days, she physically abused her young son Stephen in response to what she believed were serious offenses. She admitted to the detective that, after an initial confrontation, she began a cycle of violent acts toward him, including punching and choking him. Eventually, Blair escalated her actions by scalding him with hot water in a bathtub. She recounted how she stood him in the hot water, causing severe burns to his feet, leaving the skin blistered. Blair explained that after this series of assaults, she sent Stephen to his room, where he remained for several days. She would bring him food but continued to confine him there, expressing that she felt unsure of what to do next. During the interview, Blair mentioned calling her aunt at one point, though she chose not to share the extent of what was happening. She also considered calling the police but hesitated, fearing they would question her parenting and take her other children away. The detective attempted to clarify the timeline, as Blair's story revealed that Stephen remained in his room, suffering from his injuries, for nearly 5 days before he ultimately succumbed. Over the course of the interrogation, Blair admitted to multiple forms of abuse, including kicking and repeatedly punching him, though she maintained that she didn't initially plan for the assaults to turn lethal. In her continued confession, Michelle Blair detailed the aftermath of Stephen's passing. Following days of assault, confinement, and lack of medical attention, Stephen ultimately succumbed to his injuries. Blair expressed some regret, but admitted to a level of premeditation in the moments leading up to his death, explaining that she acted out of what she believed was necessary discipline for his behavior. After Stephen's death, Blair described her decision to place his body in the household freezer, intending to keep it concealed. She admitted she continued to live in the apartment with her other children, maintaining a sense of normalcy while Stephen's body remained hidden. When questioned by Officer Diaz, Blair struggled to explain the precise reasons or motivations behind her actions, offering fragmented thoughts that highlighted her emotional turmoil, but did little to clarify her decision-making. Blair's story grew even darker as she acknowledged that her other child, Stony, had also suffered at her hands. She explained to investigators that in a disturbingly similar scenario, she had inflicted fatal abuse upon Stony as well. In both cases, she believed she was punishing them for transgressions she assumed were justified, though she eventually acknowledged her own extreme responses were out of proportion. Throughout her statements, Blair seemed aware of the severity of her actions, yet displayed an inability to fully comprehend the consequences. As investigators continued questioning, they documented each of Blair's confessions to build a complete picture of the tragic events that unfolded within the apartment. Blair's surviving children were swiftly placed under protective custody as authorities sought to piece together the evidence and determine the full scope of the case. In her harrowing confession, Michelle Blair reveals disturbing details about the abuse that led to the death of her 9-year-old son, Stephen, in 2012. She admits that after an initial assault, she left Stephen in his room, unable to re-enter the room the following day due to heavy drinking that made her sick. She describes how she repeatedly returned to the room over several days, attempting to talk to Stephen, but ultimately assaulting him again. Despite his deteriorating condition, Blair withheld medical assistance, even as his breathing weakened and his heartbeat slowed. When Stephen finally stopped breathing, Blair attempted CPR, but ultimately failed, acknowledging that she felt his life slip away. She explains that she wrapped his body in his favorite blanket, decorated with monkeys, and placed him in the freezer. Officer Diaz then presses Blair to explain what happened to her 13-year-old daughter, Stony. Unlike with Stephen, Blair admits that her actions towards Stony were intentional. She begins to recount how she perceived Stony as a danger to Stephen, alleging that Stony had harmed him. Her initial act was to strike Stony, rationalizing it as punishment for what she believed her daughter had done to her younger brother. As the questioning continued, Blair's confessions revealed more about the prolonged abuse both children endured. Her statements, though fragmented and contradictory, painted a chilling picture of a mother consumed by a twisted sense of justification, inflicting harm on her own children under the guise of punishment. The brutal nature of Blair's actions left the investigators struggling to piece together how such a tragedy could unfold within the family. Blair's recollections of her daughter Stony's fate grew increasingly unsettling as the interrogation progressed. Officer Diaz pressed her for clarity, hoping to understand the motivations and events that led to the tragedy. "I punched her so hard because she was still doing things to him," Blair claimed, implying that she believed Stony was somehow complicit in the abuse that Stephen endured. She struggled to articulate what she meant, indicating that there was a chaotic mix of fear and anger in her mind. "I didn't find out what she was doing to him until later," she continued, suggesting a misguided attempt to protect her son while simultaneously unleashing her rage on her daughter. As Blair shared these harrowing details, it became evident that her perspective was distorted. She portrayed herself as a guardian, acting out of a twisted sense of duty to protect Stephen from Stony, whom she labeled as a threat. This perception only fueled the violence she directed toward her children. He was so scared of her, Blair said, referring to her son's fear of his sister, and she expressed a belief that her actions were justified in maintaining control over the household. The investigator sought to untangle the web of violence and fear that engulfed their home, asking Blair about specific incidents of abuse directed towards Stony. Blair described a cycle of punishment, physical attacks, and emotional manipulation. It just kept escalating, she admitted, revealing a bleak landscape of parental authority turned to cruelty. In the depths of her confession, Blair mentioned various forms of abuse: punching, kicking, and even denying food and comfort to her children. The investigator tried to piece together a timeline, asking her how long these assaults continued. Blair struggled to recall exact dates, but estimated that the pattern of violence persisted for weeks before both children met their tragic fates. Officer Diaz, maintaining his composure amidst the distressing revelations, pressed further. "What happened after you hurt Stony?" The answer came with a chilling honesty as Blair described her feelings of detachment. "I didn't know what to do with her after I hurt her. I was just lost," she stated, indicating that her actions had spiraled beyond her control. As the interrogation continued, Blair's confessions painted a grim picture of a family fractured by fear, anger, and abuse. Her attempts to rationalize her actions only deepened the investigator's concern, revealing a disturbing mindset that viewed violence as a means of maintaining order. The horrific reality of what occurred within the confines of their home became increasingly evident as Blair's chilling narrative exposed the depths of her emotional turmoil and the tragic consequences that followed. In the aftermath of these confessions, the authorities were faced with the monumental task of addressing the horrific crimes that had been committed and ensuring that the surviving children received the care and protection they desperately needed. The echoes of Blair's admissions lingered in the air, a haunting reminder of the profound impact of abuse and the desperate need for intervention in families caught in cycles of violence. As Officer Diaz continued to question Blair, the gravity of the situation became increasingly apparent. The investigator maintained a calm demeanor, trying to coax more information from her amidst the emotional turmoil. "After you put Stony in her room, what happened next?" he prompted, carefully navigating the sensitive topic. Blair's recollection remained fragmented, her thoughts racing as she tried to piece together the timeline of events. "I didn't really think about what to do next," she admitted, her voice wavering. "I was just in shock." She described a disoriented state, struggling to comprehend the violent acts she had committed against her children. With the weight of her actions hanging heavy in the air, Blair spoke of her feelings of guilt and confusion. "I just didn't know what to do after everything," she confessed, revealing a chaotic mix of emotions that plagued her. "I didn't mean for it to go that far." Despite her admissions of guilt, it was clear that she was grappling with her understanding of her own behavior. "I wrapped Stony up in a blanket," she recalled, her voice softening as she mentioned her daughter's favorite comfort item. She loved that blanket. It was a stark contrast to the violence she had just described, highlighting the complexity of her feelings toward her children. "I thought maybe that would help her feel better." Yet as the conversation unfolded, it became clear that Blair was also attempting to distance herself from the severity of her actions. "I didn't think she was dead. I just thought she was hurt," she insisted, though her story suggested otherwise. Officer Diaz pressed on, determined to clarify the sequence of events. "But you knew she was injured, and you didn't seek help," he questioned, pushing for accountability. "I didn't know how to explain it," she replied, her voice cracking. "I was scared. I didn't want them to take my kids away." Her fear of losing custody seemed to overshadow the urgency of seeking medical assistance. Instead of calling for help, Blair chose to conceal the truth, entrenching herself deeper in a web of denial and guilt. Blair then recounted how, after wrapping Stony in her beloved blanket, she left her daughter alone in her room, much like she had done with Stephen. "I thought maybe she'd just rest," she said, but her words were laced with uncertainty. The stark reality was that she had not just harmed her children, she had ultimately chosen to ignore their suffering. Days passed, during which Blair oscillated between moments of guilt and attempts to rationalize her actions. "I kept thinking about what happened, but I just didn't know how to face it," she confessed, revealing the inner conflict that tore at her. The violence she had inflicted weighed heavily on her conscience, yet her fear of the repercussions kept her from confronting the truth. Officer Diaz sought clarity on whether Blair had ever considered turning herself in or seeking help during this time. "Did you think about calling someone, telling someone what happened?" he asked, hoping to uncover any glimmer of remorse or realization. "I thought about it, but then I panicked," she admitted. "What would they think of me? I didn't want anyone to know what I did." Her fear of judgment overshadowed her maternal instincts, leading her further down a dark path of silence and isolation. The investigation revealed a pattern of abuse and neglect that had culminated in the tragic deaths of 2 innocent children. Blair's narrative was marked by moments of chilling clarity mixed with denial as she grappled with the enormity of her actions. Despite her attempts to explain her behavior, the officer could not ignore the stark reality of the situation. The children she was supposed to protect had suffered horrifically at her hands. As the interrogation continued, Officer Diaz remained focused on seeking justice for Stephen and Stony. He understood that uncovering the truth was essential not only for the children's memories, but also for preventing further tragedies in the future. Blair's confessions, while revealing, also served as a stark reminder of the consequences of unchecked violence and the urgent need for intervention in families at risk. In the end, Blair's disturbing account painted a portrait of a mother trapped in her own turmoil, unable to recognize the depth of her actions. As she navigated her emotions, the chilling reality remained. 2 lives had been lost, and a community would never be the same again. The tragedy of Stephen and Stony would echo far beyond the confines of the investigation, leaving an indelible mark on all who heard their story. As Officer Diaz continued to question Blair, the atmosphere grew increasingly tense. The details of her confessions weighed heavily, each revelation painting a darker picture of her reality. She struggled to articulate her feelings, a mixture of regret, denial, and guilt swirling within her. "Blair, you've described a lot of pain inflicted on both your children," Diaz said gently, yet firmly. "It's crucial we understand why this happened. You mentioned feeling scared. Scared of what exactly?" "I was afraid they'd take my kids away," she replied, her voice barely a whisper. "I didn't want to lose them. I thought if I just kept quiet, everything would be okay." Her fear of losing her children had twisted her judgment, leading her to believe silence was the safest option. As the conversation progressed, Diaz sought to explore the relationship between Blair and her children. "What was your relationship like with Stephen and Stony? Did they ever express fear of you?" Blair hesitated, glancing downward. "They were scared of me sometimes, I think," she admitted, her voice cracking. "I didn't mean for it to be like that, but when I got angry..." Her words trailed off, the unspoken acknowledgement of her own violent tendencies hanging in the air. "Anger is a powerful emotion, Blair," Diaz interjected. "But it doesn't justify what happened. How did you feel after you hurt them?" "I felt horrible," she said, tears beginning to form in her eyes. "But then I'd get angry again. It was like I was on a cycle. I'd feel guilty, but then something would trigger me and I'd lash out again." Her admission highlighted a troubling cycle of abuse, one that seemed inescapable for her. "Did you ever seek help for these feelings? Did you talk to anyone about your anger?" Diaz pressed. Blair shook her head. "No, I thought I could handle it on my own. I thought it would get better if I just tried harder." The weight of her isolation became apparent, revealing how she had convinced herself she could manage her emotions without external support. As the interrogation continued, Blair shared fragments of her life leading up to the tragedies. "I was drinking more often," she confessed. "It made me feel numb. I thought it would help me cope. But instead, it exacerbated her problems, clouding her judgment and fueling her violent outbursts. You mentioned that you had been drinking heavily. How did that affect your ability to care for your children?" Diaz inquired, searching for deeper insight into her mindset. "It made everything worse," Blair admitted, wiping tears from her eyes. I couldn't think straight. I was just lost. The combination of alcohol and emotional turmoil had created a dangerous environment for her children, one filled with unpredictability and fear. "Did you ever think about the consequences of your actions while you were drinking?" Diaz asked, trying to understand her thought process during those moments of violence. "I guess I didn't think about it at the time," she replied, her voice trembling. "I was just in a haze, and I didn't see how bad it was until it was too late." Her words carried a haunting truth, an acknowledgement of how easily one can slip into darkness when overwhelmed by pain and despair. As Blair reflected on her actions, Diaz pressed for more clarity. "After everything you've described, why didn't you seek help after Stony was injured?" "I was scared," she admitted again, her fear evident. "I thought I could fix it on my own. I thought I could just make it go away." The illusion of control had consumed her, blinding her to the reality of her situation. Diaz felt the weight of her confessions. He understood the complexity of human emotions, but he also recognized the imperative to hold her accountable for the pain she had inflicted. "Blair, it's important to understand that your children deserved better. They deserved a mother who would protect them, not harm them." "I know," she sobbed, the reality of her actions finally hitting her with full force. "I wish I could take it back. I wish I could change everything." As the questioning neared its conclusion, Diaz steered the conversation toward the future. "What do you hope will happen now? What do you want for your life moving forward?" Blair paused, contemplating her response. "I want to be better. I want to be the mother I should have been. I just don't know if it's too late." Her uncertainty echoed the tragic reality of her situation. Lives had been lost, and the repercussions of her actions would ripple through her community forever. The interrogation ended with Officer Diaz collecting the final pieces of her narrative. He had uncovered the painful truths surrounding the tragic deaths of Stephen and Stony, yet the emotional scars would remain long after the investigation concluded. Blair's story would serve as a reminder of the devastating consequences of neglect and violence within a family, a tragic cycle that must be broken for the sake of future generations. As Blair faced the gravity of her confessions, she was left to confront the darkest corners of her soul, one that had betrayed her children in the most horrific way. The community would mourn the loss of Stephen and Stony, while also grappling with the need for awareness and intervention in families struggling with abuse. The story of these two innocent children would not fade away. It would echo as a call for change, a reminder of the importance of compassion and understanding in the face of deep-seated pain. In a chilling crime story, a mother named Blair reveals a harrowing sequence of events leading to the deaths of her two children, Stephen and Stony. After inflicting severe injuries on Stony, the 13-year-old girl was left in her room for days, bleeding from her wounds. Instead of seeking help, Blair retreated to the basement to drink vodka, grappling with her guilt and anger. Blair admits to Officer Diaz that after discovering the extent of Stony's injuries, she stopped providing adequate food for her daughter. What began as 2 meals a day dwindled to just 1 meal of oatmeal and water over the course of 2 weeks. Blair claims that while she did not think starving Stony was the direct cause of her death, she acknowledges the profound neglect and emotional abuse she inflicted. Instead, she attributes Stony's death to asphyxiation, a claim that contradicts the medical examiner's findings, which attributed Stony's death to blunt force trauma, similar to her brother's fate. As the interrogation unfolds, Blair reluctantly recounts the events leading to Stony's demise. She describes entering her daughter's room days after the initial beating and confronting her while she slept. Startled awake, Stony apologized for her earlier actions but expressed her ongoing hatred for her brother. In a fit of rage, Blair struck her daughter, escalating the violence that had already marred their home. Under questioning, Blair reveals chilling details about her family dynamics, disclosing that only she and her children were aware of the horrific acts she had committed. She confirmed that she told her surviving children about Stony's death the same night it happened, exposing them to unimaginable trauma. Reports indicate that she forced her eldest daughter to stack Stony's body on top of Stephen's, further compounding the horror of their circumstances. When asked about her children's reactions to the sight of their dead sister, Blair recounts that they cried, with her youngest son expressing fear that she would face severe consequences. His fears were justified. In April 2015, Blair pled guilty to homicide in connection with both children's deaths. During her testimony, she chillingly remarked, "I don't feel no remorse for the death of them demons," showcasing a profound lack of empathy for the lives she had taken. Throughout her trial, Blair exhibited erratic behavior, frequently interrupting proceedings with outbursts. Ultimately, she was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Her violent tendencies did not cease in prison. She was charged multiple times for assaulting prison staff, leading to additional years added to her life sentence. Blair's story serves as a haunting reminder of the complexities of familial relationships and the tragic consequences of abuse, leaving a community in mourning for the lives of Stephen and Stony. As Blair continues to serve her life sentence, her case reverberates through the community and the media, drawing attention to the darker aspects of familial violence and the systemic failures that allowed such abuse to go unnoticed for so long. The shocking details of her actions raise questions about the support systems in place for at-risk children and the responsibilities of those who are aware of such situations. Reports emerge detailing the background of the family, illustrating a cycle of abuse and neglect that may have contributed to Blair's violent behavior. Friends and neighbors expressed disbelief, recounting a different side of Blair as a seemingly normal mother, unaware of the horrors occurring behind closed doors. This disparity highlights the often hidden nature of domestic abuse, where victims and perpetrators can mask their realities from the outside world. Community organizations rally to raise awareness about child abuse, emphasizing the need for vigilance and intervention in similar cases. Child advocacy groups begin to push for more stringent measures to protect vulnerable children, urging the public to speak up if they suspect abuse, no matter how subtle or inconspicuous it may appear. Psychologists and social workers weigh in, analyzing Blair's behavior and mental state. They suggest that her lack of remorse and the extreme violence she inflicted may indicate deeper psychological issues, potentially stemming from her own childhood experiences. This perspective sparks conversations about the impact of trauma on parenting and the need for mental health support for those who have experienced abuse themselves. The legal ramifications of Blair's actions also prompt discussions around the justice system's approach to domestic violence and child protection. Advocates argue for more resources and training for law enforcement and social services to identify and address signs of abuse before it escalates to lethal outcomes. In the years that follow, the case remains a point of reference in discussions about child welfare, prompting changes in legislation aimed at improving the detection of abuse. New policies are implemented to ensure that children have more robust support networks, and educational programs are introduced to help families recognize the signs of abuse and seek help. As for Blair, her ongoing behavior in prison, including further assaults on staff, becomes a testament to her troubled state. Her outbursts and inability to conform to prison life indicate that she remains a complex individual, wrestling with her demons even behind bars. The severity of her actions and her subsequent refusal to take responsibility contribute to her status as a notorious figure, symbolizing the catastrophic impact of unchecked familial violence. In the aftermath of this tragedy, the lives of Stephen and Stony serve as a haunting reminder of the consequences of abuse, and their story compels society to confront uncomfortable truths about family dynamics and the urgent need for vigilance in protecting children. The community reflects on the profound loss of these two young lives, recognizing the importance of breaking the cycle of violence and fostering environments where children can feel safe and loved.